we derived the aggregate demand function from the aggregate expenditure function in chapter 11. Now, let's start chapter 10.1, chapter 10, first part of chapter 10. That is, let's continue on aggregate demand. Continue on aggregate demand. So let's review the last part of chapter 11. After we draw a demand curve, the next topic is what causes a movement and what causes a shift. The answer, what causes a movement? Only one thing, the variable on the y-axis. Therefore, what causes a movement along the aggregate demand function? The answer is the price level. The price level. Then what causes a shift? The answer is anything else. Anything else that changes the demander's behavior. Then what are the aggregate demander's behavior? The answer is aggregate expenditure. Therefore, anything that changes aggregate expenditure, CIGXM, will cause a shift. But both movement and shift in the aggregate demand function go through the shift in aggregate expenditure function, because aggregate demand curve is derived from aggregate expenditure function. And we show this at the end of chapter 11. So when the price level changes, when price level goes up, aggregate expenditure function shifts down. That causes a movement along the aggregate demand function. When price level goes down, aggregate expenditure function shifts up. That also causes a movement along the aggregate demand function. If price level doesn't change, it's anything else that changes. That is, aggregate expenditure changes. That is, C or I or G or X or M changes. That will cause a shift in aggregate demand function. Okay? So the next question is, what causes C, I, G, X, and M to change so that aggregate demand curve will shift? We put the factors into three categories. That is, expectations, policies, and the world economy. These will change C and or I and or G and or X and or M. Then that will shift aggregate expenditure function and therefore shift aggregate demand function because price doesn't change. Alright, so let's go through these three factors one by one. First, expectations will shift aggregate demand curve. Say for example, if you are expected to be drafted by the NBA, next NBA draft, to be the first one overall. So you expect your future income is going to be higher. What are you going to do now? The answer is, you are going to buy a Hummer now. Even though you don't have the income yet, but you expect your future income to be higher, then you buy the Hummer now. And the car dealers will give you a car loan because you are going to make big money. Therefore, you are going to buy a Hummer. You're going to drive a Hummer as a high school student. Therefore, increases in expected future income will increase consumption today. And consumption belongs to aggregate expenditure. Therefore, aggregate expenditure shift up. Therefore, aggregate demand curve shift to the right. Second, if you expect toilet paper price to go up in the future, what should you go now? What should you do now? The answer is drive to Walmart and buy a whole bunch of toilet papers. Therefore, if you expect inflation rate to be higher in the future, then you will buy it today. So consumption increases, aggregate expenditure increases because consumption is part of aggregate expenditure. Therefore, aggregate demand shifts to the right. If Ford expects that they are going to get more profit by selling their cars in the future, what should they do now? The answer is they should build more cars now. That is, they are going to invest more money. They are going to buy metals, tires, and they are going to hire more people. How can they pay people salary? They have to borrow money to do investment. Therefore, if Ford expects future profit to be higher, then they should build more cars now. They should invest more now. Therefore, investment increases. Investment is part of the aggregate expenditure function. Therefore, aggregate expenditure increases. Therefore, aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. The second factor is policies. This is very important because the final part of this semester is all about policies. And there are two types of policies: fiscal policies and monetary policies. Let's talk about fiscal policy first. So who conducts the fiscal policy? The answer is the government. The president, the governors, the Congress, the Senate, the local governments. Why? Why are they fiscal policy conductors? Because they are the ones that control the fiscal policy tools. What are the fiscal policy tools? Two of them: taxes and spending, government spending. These two are fiscal policy tools. And who controls these two tools? The answer is government. So a tax cut or a negative tax cut, that is, increase in transfer payments, that will increase the household's disposable income. Remember, income minus tax is the disposable income, and transfer payment is just like a negative tax. And consumption is a function of disposable income, right? And disposable income is income minus tax. Therefore, when tax goes down, disposable income goes up. Therefore, consumption goes up. Therefore, aggregate expenditure increases. Therefore, aggregate demand shifts to the right. The second tool is the government expenditure. And government expenditure is part of the aggregate expenditure. Therefore, when government expenditure increases, aggregate expenditure increases, aggregate demand shift to the right. Monetary policy. Who conducts monetary policy? Well, depends on who controls the monetary policy tools. What are the monetary policy tools? The answer is interest rates and money. So who controls interest rate and money? The answer is the central bank. You have never heard about President Trump lowering interest rate or raising interest rate. No, it's not his job. It's the Federal Reserve Bank's job, the central bank's job. So, make sure you understand this. Government conducts fiscal policy. Central bank conducts monetary policy. Governments control taxes and government spending. Central banks is responsible for interest rate and money. So when quantity of money increases, that is, the central bank inject more liquidity into the economy, it's easier for you to get a mortgage, it's easier for you to borrow a car loan, then you are going to buy a house, you are going to buy a car. Therefore, household consumption increases, aggregate expenditure increases, aggregate demand curve shift to the right. Interest rate is the cost for firms to borrow money. Right? Therefore, if the central bank cuts the interest rate, it's cheaper for firms to borrow money. Therefore, they are going to invest more. Also, if the interest rate is lower, mortgage rate is lower, car loan rate is lower, you are going to buy houses. You are going to buy a house, you are going to buy a car. Consumption will also increase. Therefore, aggregate expenditure increases. Therefore, aggregate demand curve shift to the right. Finally, CIG. Remember, the foreign sector. The foreign sector also determine the aggregate expenditure function. So let's talk about the foreign sector. Okay, exchange rates. Exchange rate. Say for example, exchange rate between US dollar and Japanese yen is usually expressed as yen per dollar. Say for example, the exchange rate between Japanese yen and US dollar is 100 yens per dollar. That means Japanese can use 100 yens to buy 1 US dollar from us. Or we can use 1 US dollar to buy 100 Japanese yens. That is what the exchange rate means. Now, if a fall in the exchange rate, say for example, exchange rate falls from 100 to 50. So 100 yens to 50 yens per dollar. Then, originally, we can use $1 to buy 100 yens. Now, we can only use $1 to buy 50 yens only. So the value of our dollar decreases against yen, right? Because we can buy less yen with our dollar. So we call that dollar depreciates. against yen. If dollar depreciate against yen, what will happen? Now think about this. In the US, we produce 4 F-150. And the Ford set the price to be $30,000 for F-150. Now in Japan, if a Japanese wants to buy this F-150, Ford is going to charge them $30,000. When exchange rate is 100 yens per dollar, then how many yens does the Japanese have to use to buy $30,000? The answer is they use 100 yens to buy a dollar. Therefore, they need 3 million yens to buy $30,000 if the exchange rate is 100 yens per dollar. What if now exchange rate is 50 yens per dollar? Then how many yens do they need to buy $30,000? The answer is 1.5 million yens, sorry. 1.5 million yens. Is this Japanese happy because of this? The answer is yes. It's cheaper to buy F-150 from the United States now for Japanese. Therefore, the depreciation of dollar lowers the price of F-150 in Japan. Therefore, our export to Japan increases. Same thing, our import from Japan decreases because Japanese becomes more expensive in the United States. And because aggregate expenditure is export minus imports. When export increases, import decreases, the net export increases. Therefore, aggregate expenditure increases. Aggregate demand shifts to the right. Another factor is an increase in foreign income. Remember, export doesn't depend on our income, but export depends on foreign income. It's like imports depends on our income. So our export to the other country is the other country's imports, which depends on their income. So an increase in foreign income will increase our export. Therefore, export increases, aggregate expenditure increases, aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. So, what will increase aggregate demand? Expected income, expected inflation, expected profits, tax cut, increase in government expenditure, increase in money supply, decrease in interest rates, depreciation of dollars, increase in foreign income. So 3 categories will all increase aggregate expenditure, shift aggregate demand curve to the right. So the other way, expected income decreases, expected inflation decreases, expected profit decreases, tax increase, government expenditure decreases, money supply decreases, interest rate increases, etc. will shift aggregate demand curve to the left. Now, let's go to the second part of chapter 10.